Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Shelley Rogers, and I am part of the web team here at Liberty Fund. It is my pleasure to have you join us today for our latest installment of From the Shelf with Curator Arnold Kling. Before I turn it over to Arnold and our panelists, I would like to introduce Rebecca Burgess and Michael Lucchese. And in about 30 minutes, I'm going to open up our conversation for questions. Please either use the Q&A or raise hand feature, and I'll invite you to ask your question live. Arnold?
Okay, well, I'd like to thank the two other panelists. Rebecca has the background in defense policy and the humanities. That's the way it appears to me. And she's employed at the Yorktown Institute, correct? And Michael is a visiting scholar at the Liberty Fund and founded a communications consulting firm. So the way I approached this book, which I found quite difficult actually, but the way I approached it is to think in terms of two questions about sort of male-female roles. One is first question is, are there high-status occupations that are predominated by one sex or the other? And the second is, are there restrictions on sexual behavior that are applied differently to one sex or another in the cultural norms? So that, first of all, is that a reasonable framework for asking the questions about this book? And it seemed to me that he had three kind of phases where sort of prior to 1950, high status occupations, a lot of them were reserved for males. And also a lot of the social norms were directed at restricting female sexual behavior, or that seemed to be the intent. Then there's kind of a liberation phase where women are getting more access to high status occupations and their sexual behavior is not restricted so much. And then what he sees kind of currently and more recently is women starting to dominate certain high status occupations and male sexual behavior being more restricted by cultural norms. Just let me ask Rebecca, did you take that away from the book? And if so, what do you think of that as a description?
Well, I think I guess I approached it a little bit differently, which was, why do women seem to be so unhappy despite the fact that they seem to be doing so much better historically than they ever have before, at least in the West? And is it because they are in these occupations that previously they had not been in, at least to these degrees? And to what extent, of course, is that entire equation kind of anchored on the fact of women's sexual liberation and the invention of the pill? And it seems to me that in very roundabout ways, and as you mentioned, difficult ways, the author eventually concludes that, yes, the pill is in fact absolutely fundamental to understanding how women have been able to get into higher status occupations today.
And do we buy that? I mean, part of me thinks that the demographic transition, where women went from basically constantly trying to bear children, to a situation where they, family size was limited, that transition started well before the pill.
Hmm.
So does that raise some questions about this?
Sure. I mean, though, of course, I always have, and I am, of course, not an anthropologist. I don't spend that much time, in fact, reading that literature. There's just too many other interesting things I find. So I do have to preface that, with saying I haven't looked recently at some of those studies that do document and chart the kind of decline of the size of families, et cetera, in relation with the Industrial Revolution, and those types of things. But I do think, but I've always kind of resisted that approach, which is it really a sign of success or progress for women having less children, and family size being smaller, that we say it is? I mean, is that really the right indice? I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested in what Michael thinks about that, but I've just always found it a little awkward, to think that somehow, family size is a smaller family size is a sign of positive progress.
Yeah, well, I guess before I let Michael jump in, I think there are kind of two aspects. One is lowered infant mortality, which is, gives you the choice, but to either have a large family or not, without having going through pregnancy a lot. And then the other is the decision, well, how many children do you have? So lowered infant mortality seems like obviously an unambiguous good. Sort of
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And that is actually an important, I think, clarification, is that, many families would attempt to have as many children as possible because you didn't know how many would actually survive into adulthood.
Yeah.
And so, especially if you're talking about, carrying on the lineage of your family, you want as many possibilities there as possible. And also different religious and cultural, appraisals of children as being benefits or being blessings, or, that as well as go into the equation.
Yeah, Michael, you better unmute if you're going to join here.
Yeah, when I was reading this book, I was really struck by the politics of the book. At the beginning, he talks about the yellow vest movement in France, and has this sort of interesting notion that part of the reason for this populist uprising we're seeing across the West is because society is becoming feminized, or to use his term, a matra-dominated ideological system. And when I was reading this, I couldn't help but think of another book, Harvey Mansfield's Manliness, that came out sometime in the Bush administration, I think. Mansfield in that book has an interesting definition of manliness, which is linked to this old concept of spiritedness, right? And Mansfield argues that certain women who achieve political leadership, one of those high status roles I think Todd is talking about, that they're manly women. And his great example of this is Margaret Thatcher, right? And sort of the motivation she feels towards honor to say defend the Falkland Islands during the war with Argentina. And so I'm curious about how we might fit in these Mansfield manly women into this sort of matra-dominated ideological system that Todd is talking about, right? Because in some ways, it seems like those kinds of leaders are advancing, or breaking the glass ceiling, letting women higher up into political leadership, these elite sectors of society. But on the other hand, it seems like part of the reason that they are successful leaders, part of the reason why they're admired by society, is because in some ways they sort of violate certain ideas of femininity that we have. and Todd doesn't really talk very much about this, but I think it would be interesting to analyze some of this anthropology he's doing from a political perspective like that.
Yeah, my sense is that if I were to guess, he would say that that Thatcher is not a good example of what he's talking about, right? That what he's talking about is women bringing a sort of a feminine ideology, or a feminine, not so much ideology, but a feminine approach to the fields that they're dominating. And so then we can then raise the fraud issue of what that is, and how that operates.
Well, I would chime in to say I definitely fraught, but it is the interesting, I guess, elephant in the room is that, as he notes, as women have become dominant in a lot of these more scientific fields, their focus tends to shift the entire field towards more kind of psychological type of questions or analyses, which seems to revert back to this idea that women are interested in fraught feelings,
Yeah.
but relationships, how people feel and think and experience, as opposed to, and it's not saying that that's not a science and not scientific, and very difficult in its way, but also it's different from hard science. It's different from physics. It's different from chemistry, and equations and those types of things. And that to me is interesting. And I think it plays out at numerous levels. You can, why are our universities and our entire educational system so predominant with administrators now, rather than teachers, you could say? And why are these administrators tasked so much with the behavior of employees, of students, of managing, these behaviors in all types of different fields? And to me, it seems like that could be potentially the relationship there, is that this is an interest of women constantly.
Yeah. Well, he and it's very personal with him. I guess his longtime association is with this demographic institute. And he says, when I started out, we were sort of mathematical modelers, and now we're gender theorists, which, so you can see that, he personally feels affected by that.
Yeah, for sure.
Related to this concept of gender theory, I was very interested in his depiction of the Middle Ages and the role that Christianity played in the relationship between men and women in the Middle Ages, and this idea that this sort of the chivalrous mores of civilization and of Christendom, really, they were sort of designed to protect women. And I wonder about this sort of class of administrators that Rebecca is describing, and if the sort of administrators or behavioral regulators of the Middle Ages were trying to protect women from the strength of men, I wonder what it is that this class is trying to protect or promote. What are sort of, if these are sort of the social goals of Christendom, I wonder what the social goals of to be maybe a little provocative, the feminized administrative state, what those social goals might be.
I would like to know that too.
And, I guess, a lot of it is, sort of protecting people's feelings, right? And that, somebody, gets triggered, that's protecting feelings. And, and in a very different way, protecting women sexually. I think my impression is that, sort of what came out of the Middle Ages was a notion that women should be chaste, chaste, not chased, should be, not, not, should not have any, sex out of desire for sex, but should be protected in that way. Whereas the modern feminism assumes that, well, women can desire sex and that is okay, but the protection has to come from males who are inherently predatory in some way. So it's a different view of the ideal for women, but it does get back to protecting them in some ways from aggressive sexual behavior. But there's in some ways they're supposed to be able to protect them, live in a society where they are protected, versus in the sort of the middle age view, versus now they can actively call out men who they think have behaved like predators.
My research at Liberty Fund is into John Quincy Adams and the Adams family more generally, and there's a really interesting exchange of letters between John and Abigail Adams in the spring of 1776 that I think is kind of in a strange way relevant here. Abigail writes, I believe it's in March 1776, she writes to John and she says, oh, we're about to declare independence as a country, we're breaking free from British tyranny, and as we do that, the famous phrase is she wants John to remember the ladies, and she wants a new constitution that will recognize more rights for women than were allowed in the colonial charter or in the colonial social order. And John writes back, I think it's in April, after he gets her letter, and it's a very joking exchange. It's kind of delightful to go back and read. And he says that that's a good point, and that's something that we should do, but also that there can be, his phrase for it is the tyranny of the petticoat, and he warns that we shouldn't completely repeal masculine systems. Those are his phrases. And so I wonder if what Todd has sort of documented in this book is the repeal of masculine systems, and if he has sort of revealed that we're living in an age of the tyranny of the petticoat, as it were. And given that, he nonetheless says at the beginning of the book that he considers himself a feminist and is an ally of feminism and the women's liberation movement. But he also sounds this sort of cautionary term. And so I wonder how far is too far in Todd's mind, and what do we make of that?
Well, let's use a specific example, the sort of the norms and institutions around free speech, where that's the defenses of that are always sort of systemic. Like, if we have free speech, then we won't have, we won't go down the wrong road because of groupthink. We'll get, the contest of ideas will yield better results. So it's defended from a system perspective, but it's attacked from the sort of feelings perspective that, there will be hurtful speech. So I think that, if we use that as an example, then and I think he does use that example, that as institutions become more female dominated, you will lose the advantages of free speech. And anyway, do we buy that as a general story?
I mean, it's certainly provocative, and it looks on presentation, on face value, if not convincing, at least something to be considered carefully, for sure. And it raises very uncomfortable questions, of course, for women themselves and the proponents of all women all the time, everywhere, which is, there's actually and I think he mentions this, or it could have been a different article I was reading, that regularly on any type of survey, whether scientific or public polls, both men and women always rate women better than men, no matter kind of what it is, if it's about behaviors, if it's about violence, if it's about crime, it's about performance issues, both men and women better than men. But it's simply not true that women are less violent as a standard thing than men, that women don't participate in crime the way that men do. There's a rise in female violence that has been coinciding with the last 30 years. Which he doesn't really, if I'm remembering right, he doesn't actually get into, but which I think would be important even for his own argument about what it means to have this, the rise of women in high status occupations, and just more generally. So I think that is something that needs to be looked at a bit more. And to go back to Michael's point, something that I was thinking about in his discussion was how Tocqueville talks about this very question, in America, and says, and his analysis or his conclusion is that, yes, in America, women are treated better. They're valued more than in Europe. And you can see this by the rape laws. If a man is convicted of rape, he's killed, he's murdered, he's put on death row, because that is something that he's taken away from a woman that can never be given back. And that also, the instances of false accusations down, because that is the severest penalty that someone could inflict. And so it kind of kept a more honest relationship, if you will. And it definitely, I would think, helped men to police their own actions better, because of the potential threat of an accusation, or if they really did rape a woman, then the reality of that. And so in a way, while we have all of these kind of surface protections today for women of social media, Me Too movement, but the consequences in terms of our laws, in fact, aren't as severe to actually show doing something like that to a woman is as significant today as it actually was socially and criminally before.
And can I go back to something you started with, was this question of, are women happier now when you would think that they should be? I actually forgot what his take on that was. What did he have a strong take?
And correct me, Michael, if I'm wrong here. What I took away was, he says they're less happy for sure today, because now they're experiencing not just the social status that men had, they're experiencing all of the things that came along with those worries, essentially male worries. He puts it, I think he actually uses that term, which means, the anxieties that go into being, highly ambitious and highly forward looking and career oriented, and, breadwinners, or that type of a thing, even if they're not a breadwinner in their own house, as in the principal breadwinner. they might be or consider themselves as the breadwinner. And so all of those types of you could say, pathologies or characteristics are influencing women. What I thought was curious, strange, but so French, was that he then turns this into a kind of communist type of thing. And if you remember, he ends the book on this note of women need to get over themselves and unite together in a class to make the world better, in a very communistic type of way. And I thought, well, that was a strange place to end it, but French.
Yeah, well, his accusation that women are less communitarian than men. I mean, you know, at one level, men will, you know, they do like team sports, and so that, but I don't know that that makes them communitarian. And then he goes on to accuse women of sort of being, you know, the leaders of the neoliberal faction, when I guess he's, you know, much more on the left economically. That was a strange one. Michael,
Yeah.
reaction to that?
Well, I think Rebecca's comment that this is very French is very perceptive. If you think about the role of women in the United States as opposed to old Europe, right? I think women have always had played a very different role in the household here. You know, I'm from the Midwest, right? And so the image of the pioneer on the plains is sort of ingrained into my moral imagination. And I think that one of the things that's important about that is men and women, especially in that sort of pioneer American expansion enterprise, were basically equals all the way through, right? Men and women both tended the crops. They both raised livestock when you were out on the prairie. You needed all of the parts of the family to sort of, you know, carve out that space of safety, carve out these sort of enclaves on in the wilderness. And that's just not really a phenomenon in Europe, right? And so the pioneer mother is not really a character in this book. But I do wonder if a lot of the problems that is identifying, which I think are genuine problems, and I think that, you know, the data he compiles is very, very compelling. I wonder if one of the potential solutions, rather than sort of uniting in this vanguard Leninist female class, I don't really understand this. Instead of uniting in this vanguard, I wonder if these sort of older American conceptions of the role of the family and the relative equality of husband and wife, I wonder if that actually points us towards a more stable, maybe truce is the wrong word, but if there's some kind of treaty that can come out in the war of the sexes here.
Yeah, well, that might be a good question to sort of end our discussion on, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Is sort of what would you like the resolution to look like in these, you know, what's the desirable equilibrium relationship among men and women? So let me throw that at Rebecca first.
Well, I think you know, augmentarity is what is built in a way into nature. I mean, I believe that, and I think that trying to refine that, what is it in the situation of, you know, this modern contemporary world where we have access, both men and women, to such technology that we are so free to be able to pursue all of these other things that we never were able to do before, that enables, say, myself as a woman to, you know, to live by myself, either in the middle of a remote, you know, plain, or in the middle of a bustling city, and have all the services that I need that traditionally maybe I would need to rely on a man for. I don't need to do that any longer, because I can, you know, hire a mechanic or do it myself also. So trying to figure out, now that women have all of these kind of freedoms or ability to explore things that they haven't historically or haven't thought of historically to explore. What does it mean to do that and also be a woman? I mean, it really does come down, I think, to questions about existential questions, and of course belief and religious belief shapes part of that response, I do believe, but being able to find a respectful complementarity and allow men to be good at what they traditionally have been good at, and allow them, as Michael said, to have some honor in the workplace, in the labor force, and not take that away constantly, by saying that if women aren't involved, that it's illegitimate, or something like that. I just don't see how that can continue and be sustainable. And definitely at the level of kind of relationships, if we're constantly at war with each other or see each other as the enemy, I'm not I guess maybe that's where the any population problem will go, because we won't be consorting with each other. But I mean, but on the serious note, I do think that it is absolutely important and essential to try and recapture for both men and women what a woman and I mean is in the modern world.
Hey, Michael, you're right.
Yeah, well, I will not presume to speak for women, needless to say. But I'm glad that Rebecca brought up religious belief, because it reminded me of an essay C.S. Lewis wrote called The Necessity of Chivalry, where he says that there are sort of two sides to man's nature. One side is fierce and warlike, right? It's the ability to go out and conquer your enemies and protect your community in battle. And then the other side of man is this sort of Lewis's word for it is meekness, right? This peaceability, this ability to live in community without conflict. And Lewis says that you need both of these things to go together, right? And he critiques various political movements, whether it's sort of pacifistic liberalism on the one hand, or fascism on the other hand, or communism even maybe, where they overemphasize one side of this nature or the other. And he proposes what you need to do is you need to have some kind of working concept, which he calls chivalry, that holds these two sides of man's nature together. And so developing a space and an understanding of how man can be chivalrous and how he can unite that fierceness and that meekness, I think that's what's really important here. The question is, and I think this is a very open question, can you do that without some kind of shared social religious faith, right? Do you need a religious conception of what a man is, what a woman is, in order to have that kind of unity of chivalry? Or can we do it with more secular concepts? I think the jury is still very much out on that.
Yeah, I like the phrase that Rebecca introduced, your respectful complementarity, because when I think what we're at now is sort of a general reaction of it, yay women, boo men, kind of, and that isn't going to get us there. And and if the only alternative is go back to some previous period where women were repressed either on the status occupation dimension or on the sexual control dimension, I think that's not the solution either. But again, yeah, this phrase respectful complementarity would be a better equilibrium to get to. With that, can we start to get some questions from the audience?
We do. John Alcorn, if you would like to unmute, you have the floor.
It's very stimulating, and I have a few questions. I'll take one at random. So the recurrent theme that Dr. Kling emphasized of protecting women from predatory men, whether in the Middle Ages or on college campuses today, say, a constant parameter seems to be that sex usually takes place behind closed doors. So when wrongdoing occurs, there's often a problem of evidential warrant. He said, she said. Might this explain why modern culture exhibits both women's sexual liberation and the progressive emphasis on protecting women? It's built in to the privacy of sex.
I think that's a really insightful question, and I think that it speaks to the increasing lack of privacy in human lives, right? Like everywhere I go, I carry a phone with me, right? And that means that I have less privacy, right? Inherently, people are able to get in contact with me. You know, I have a tracker on my phone, right? And so I think that there's just less and less privacy in modern society, and so maybe one of the essential things for reaching some kind of a truce or reducing some of the negative effects of the so-called feminization of society that Todd sees would be to try to carve out a little bit more social space for privacy. Actually, we need more privacy, not less privacy.
But that still doesn't get at this issue of how to then resolve he said, she said kind of those kinds of issues, which I know John's on a college campus, and that's a very fraught issue on college campuses, where sort of there's a fear that an accusation of impropriety becomes presumption of guilt.
So I have direct experience here, unfortunately, as I was an administrator working in student life at a college campus. So I regularly had to deal with this type of situation, students coming to me, reporting something. And it's interesting here because, and I'm in no way saying like this is a legal thing, so no one take this as a legal standard or anything, but in talking to both men and women students about, say, a potential situation of a rape or unwanted advance, or something along those natures, there are ways that women describe their behavior and ways that they act that are they're patterns. And there are ways that men talk about it. And it is, if you are paying enough attention, it is quite easy to figure out often when a man is lying or when a woman is lying about the sequence of events that happened. And so often, and now that I no longer are doing student life issues, and when I read about them in the news, I always look at how did they follow the train of evidence? How did they question? How did they, establish the facts of the case? And so often they're relying on third parties, and you just can't do that. You have to hear from the victims and the alleged perpetrators themselves, and you have to ask them frequently to go over their story in numerous different ways and their questions. And so, I mean, there are ways that, say, men describe, not all men, of course, so we're talking about some bad actors here, an encounter of like, well, she just wanted it. How do you know she just wanted it? Well, she was just sitting there, like, that's okay. That was neither an invitation, nor anything else. And that's where, it comes back to some of these kind of biology and also, I guess, learned behavior characteristics come to the fore. That I, just from those alone would say that men and women are different. They're different in how they talk about these encounters, how they approach sex itself, and the wanting or the enjoying of it. And you just can't get around those things. And so actually being truthful, I think, and having standards that are rigorously applied, no matter the situation. This is not just in, these on-campus, off-campus, sexual assault situations, but it kind of in anything. Having that kind of truth standard and the rigorous kind of assessment, which I feel has really fallen off the table. And that leads to distrust. And that distrust is what I think we're really talking about here, in which no one, that you have the women or the men, by the way, because there are men who, there's a percentage of males who also experience sexual assault, who, well, I got all mixed up there in what exactly I was saying, but the distrust issue makes it that much more difficult for both sides to feel as though their recounting of events will be taken seriously, truthfully, and investigated, and therefore the storytelling starts to become more important than the actual establishment of the facts.
Ron, did you have another question that you wanted to ask? I know you had several in the chat.
Yeah, I'd like to, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's striking that educational attainment has changed a lot when you compare men and women. Circa 1970, maybe 60% of college degrees were men. And today it's the other way around, and the gap is growing. And at the same time, people more and more tend to marry at their education level. You put those two things together, you have imbalance in what economists call the marriage market, a lot of educated women and not enough educated men, if people want to marry at their education level. And the educated women also at least begin career before taking, if they want to have children, it's postponed because they want to establish career first. And so that also helps to explain the decline in the birth rate in all prosperous societies where education is the path to career. So educational attainment is differential educational attainment by sex seems to explain a lot. And so then I want to know, why do women fare so much better in school? And why do women cotton so much more to school? Because it's very consequential.
I mean, I would say, and I think there have been several studies looking at this, or it is one of those topics of debate. And it seems to me that our educational structures is simply more favorable to women than it is to men today. I don't think that was necessarily always the case, but I think it definitely is more so today. Just the experience of my own family, there are several girls in my family and one boy, and he just learned differently than we did. But if you have one kind of rigid structure that prioritizes sitting still in a classroom, and kind of book learning, as you'd say, like, women just do tend to do better at that. They're more docile in ways, sitting in their chairs and learning. And boys need a lot more activity and a lot more hands-on. And that, I would say, the shift that you're describing also describes a shift in what is happening in the classroom. So, the kind of technical type of the workshop classes, wood shop classes, those types of skills that used to be taught in schools also went away. And so you don't have those outlets for either men or women, to do. And so where are we at today? We are facing a situation where there are not enough plumbers, there are not enough electricians, there are not enough, because we never gave a pathway to that as a career. And by the way, those are six-figure careers, can be anyway. Today, because we societally placed them as a non-acceptable or a non-respectable profession and career path. And I think to me, what's positive, glimmers of change is that, especially in the last, 10 years, that is beginning to be reversed. There are, with a lot of these charter schools, there are schools that are being developed that are explicit, bring in some of those kind of trade skills and understand that there are different ways of learning, that not every child, every boy or girl learns the same way. And so it's long, it's a long process. We're talking, 12 years of education, 13 years of education at least, and so 13 years from now, will we start to see a difference? I mean, hopefully. But I think that's kind of where we're at.
I agree really thoroughly with everything Rebecca just said. And I want to add something to complicate her 13-year time span a little bit more. I think that the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and choosing to move our lives online, I think that this is going to have massive effects on our education system. I've heard some people refer to the pandemic as creating a learning deficit across all sorts of different subjects, right? It seems like students just did not learn the way they had been previously. And so I think that those 2 or so, maybe 3 years where things were strange because of coronavirus, I think that's going to affect that very deeply. And I think it's probably too early to say, but I'm also curious about, I am sure that women and girls were very negatively affected by learning under the coronavirus conditions, just as men were. But I'm curious if Rebecca, you referred to sitting still in the classroom as one of the things women are better at, or girls are better at than boys. That seems true to me, and I wonder how if women adapted better to the sort of virtual environment created by the conditions of the pandemic than men did. The answer could be no, right? And it could have just been awful for everybody. But I also wonder if this is going to exacerbate that that educational attainment divide that John is talking about.
That's super interesting. Definitely don't have any data, that I know of. I'm sure someone is already looking at that. But that, I could see it going both ways, if you will. Just anecdotally watching my godson, who is 5 years old and should have been in kindergarten then. And his parents were frustrated because they're like, he's not paying attention. Well, it turns out, he got it so quickly and then he was bored. And in a classroom, at least there are some other activities or things that you can kind of do. But when your parents are both working from home too, and he was just there. What are you going to do? So yeah, I guess, lots of research and data, down the pike for us to be looking at, keeping our eyes open for that, for sure.
Well, thank you, John. We've got a couple of people on the queue. Tom, you're next. And then Roger, I have you up after Tom.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
I want to talk about a couple of bad lifestyle choices for especially the non-college bound young adults. And those lifestyle choices are crime and the casual sex promiscuity. And that the promiscuity especially is related to the women, where the pill was important for the casual sex, but there's also this big lie in feminism about equality, with the idea that women like casual sex as much as men. And I think almost everybody knows that's not really true. And of course, if there was a metric like orgasms, most men would have orgasms in casual sex, and quite a few women, maybe even most of them, would not on the first time they have sex or on a one-night stand. My point on that is that love is both the pleasure of sex, but also commitment or relationship. And what women are looking for is more relationship. And what men are often looking for is the sexual pleasure. And that's, you were talking about the war of the sexes and the truces and the treaties. These different desires, what women want and what men want, should be a little bit more honestly spoken about. And along with that, besides the pill, there's also the media, where casual sex and promiscuity is much, much more photogenic, like with James Bond, than actual commitment. And that's sells tickets, but it also gets into the social, this is the way people are. And I think that that's a big problem. Unfortunately, part of my solution is to go back to slut shaming. And that means the women having promiscuous sex will be called out as sluts and they'll feel bad. And the current idea that they shouldn't feel bad, I think, is part of the unreality delusion of, if the promiscuous casual sex is causing women to be unhappy, and that's my claim that it is, then disincentivizing them includes making some shame about their actual behavior.
So
So that's what my question is.
So let me ask on top of that. So is this a sort of a cultural phenomenon or a sort of structural phenomenon that has the sort of sexual marketplace changed so that sort of men have an advantage? Assuming a man wants casual sex more than a woman, and that men are now at an advantage and women are at a disadvantage.
Certainly in colleges, they would say that that's the case.
Yeah, but you would think it would be the other way around in principle, maybe at, among non-college educated, but I don't think it is the other way around. So, is it a sort of a structural phenomenon or a culture, or is it a norms, norms phenomenon? But it does strike me as strange and not really pro-women to have the expectation that a relationship actually starts with sex. It doesn't. I'm old enough, and you can tell I'm older, to remember the days when it was unheard of to have sex on a first date or even a second or third date, which sounds to me like that works better for women. But so anyway, has that changed because of norms or because of the way the marketplace has changed? And
it's probably both, right? I mean, a lot of the norms have changed, and that's just irrefutable. And why this kind of gets back to the question, outside of religion, why do we have manners at all? And one of the things that manners does is to inhibit certain behaviors. And there's both a kind of a social elegance to that, but there's often deeper reasons, and it is about protecting. Well, often it was about protecting women from men who were, otherwise kind of left free to their own devices. But it also instilled in women a certain evaluation of who they are and what they're worth. And so I would say, this gets into very deep questions, and there are as you mentioned earlier, fraught. These are all fraught. But if you tell women that they aren't inherently worthwhile, that they are, and that they shouldn't think of themselves as that way, why then should they hold themselves that way? There's these inherent contradictions that women, I would say, since the pill, have been kind of forced into, and then told not to think about them, which is you and the social pressure, by the way. And this was, I would say, I didn't feel it so much when I went to school, to college, this is, 2000, but my female teachers talked about the pressure put on them in the 80s and the 90s, that they were strange and weird and pariahs if they didn't engage in sex all the time, essentially, which is, once again, kind of a male, thing. But this is where I really think that there might be something changing in the groundswell from underneath, which is everyone kind of went crazy, right? I don't know how else to put it. And as things kind of normalize, and as these younger women are now 40 years old or 50 years old and 60 years old and are looking back at their lives and thinking, wait, that didn't work out for me so well. What is it that we're telling our daughters? What is it that we're telling our sons? That wasn't the right way to do it. Here's a better way, or what would have been the better way. And we have all of this data and reports. And of course, you always have to wonder, because these are people talking about their own experiences. So are they really truthful? but the current generation is having less sex than before. That's simply, and there's even, these kind of Atlantic articles talking about why don't generation, whatever the generation is today, like sex or something like that, and I think this could be a part of that kind of going backlash about, wait, that didn't produce any happiness. It in fact destroyed kind of the ability to build the fabric of relationships. What even are relationships? And that's kind of where we're at, I think, today, is that in fact we don't know how to have relationships with each other. Not even speaking about men and women, but especially men and women don't know how to have relationships, but we don't actually know how to have relationships with our fellow human beings.
Once again, I find myself very much in agreement with Rebecca. I'm not sure that I could endorse a policy of more shame in society necessarily. But I do think what Rebecca is saying about manners and sort of rethinking the nature of relationships, I think that's really important. And I think that it's something that our education system generally neglects, right? And I think that one long-term, and this would be a very long-term solution given what we were talking about, education. I think that we might want to introduce something into the literary and moral education of America's youth about this sort of thing. So maybe as a matter of public policy, we should make all of America's young people read more Jane Austen or something. But the idea should be that we should be trying to give young people sort of positive models for these kinds of relationships. And I think that's something our society has not really generally done very well over the last 50 plus years.
Well, thank you, Tom. Roger, I've got you on deck if you are ready.
You have to unmute.
Okay. Roger, we can't understand you.
Well, that's you're okay. You're gonna have to.
Yeah, Roger, we can't hear you. So if you can fix your audio, just let me know.
Or you can write it in chat, maybe.
Correct. We have about one more minute or so. If we can do one more question, if somebody has one. Oh, Tom has another one. Tom, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to mention somebody that I've started reading thanks to an earlier Arnold Kling link. Her name is Tove K. She's from Sweden, and she wrote a really good article. She's written a lot of articles about human sexuality, but one I thought was very important about female evolution, where 13 million years ago, humans separated from gorillas and great apes, and then about 5 million years ago from chimpanzees. And if you look at the great apes, one of the things is about 1 in 7 gorilla children are killed by a male gorilla. And very often, the mother of that gorilla child that's killed starts mating with the gorilla that has killed the child. This is just an actual fact. Then if you look at the chimpanzees, the many females, both the chimpanzees and the bonobos, are quite promiscuous. And part of that is to hide from the chimpanzees, who also kill children frequently, that exactly who is the father. And she claims, which I believe, in both cases, it's an attempt to avoid the children being killed by the fathers, so that the fathers are raising their own children, which is sort of a genetic thing that fathers want to do, male fathers. And of course, human men are like that. And I mention this because of the protection that you were both talking about with respect to women. And I certainly hope that the upswing, the current much less sex is going to be followed by much better relations. But I don't believe that's going to happen before the demographic time bomb goes off to -10 or -20% of population. So I'm wondering what your level of population reduction is, or if it's going to continue growing.
Well, I am no expert in crystal ball gazing for sure. So it's really out of my area. I think as long as there are human beings there, and there are some good people. Oh, here's the line I'll take. I'll take James Madison's line in the Federalist. That as this whole Republican experiment, the whole human experiment, kind of depends on enduring human nature, seeing something positive in the world and wanting to perpetuate it. That is at the heart of wanting to, come together and create children and raise them, for the next generation, is thinking that there is something worthwhile in life and in the world. And so as long as you have enough people who are doing that, then you'll have a future human race. Maybe it will be smaller. But at least it will endure for as long as it's meant to endure. And so here it comes back to that question of education, and the absolute importance that every society that is worth its salt knows of an education system that perpetuates and instills hopeful values in its youth, and gives them then the means both socially and culturally and economically to be able to pursue those lives.
Okay, so that's one of the few positive notes we had. So let's maybe end on that.
Yes. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Arnold, for joining us today. I dropped in the chat a link to register for our EconLib monthly newsletter. That'll definitely keep you informed for future from the shelf videos that we're going to be doing. So we hope you can join us in December and then throughout 2024. Again, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.